John was a young man who loved his wife, Mary, very much. They had met in the city, fallen in love, and decided to get married. Their wedding was simple but beautiful, held in a small church with a few friends and family members. John was the happiest man that day, holding Mary's hand and smiling as they exchanged vows. But there was one person who was not happy, his mother, Mrs. Susan. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. Mrs. Susan had always wanted John to marry a woman she had chosen for him. She had someone else in mind, a rich young lady from their village, but John did not love her. He loved Mary, and nothing could change his mind. This made Mrs. Susan very angry. She believed Mary had used some magic to win her son's heart. From the first day Mary entered John's family home, Mrs. Susan did not hide her hatred. She refused to welcome Mary and did not speak to her unless necessary. Whenever John was not around, Mrs. Susan would give Mary a cold look and walk away. "Mother, why are you treating Mary like this?" John asked one evening. "I do not trust her," Mrs. Susan said. "She is not the right woman for you. I can feel it in my heart." "But, Mother, I love her," John said gently. "She is my wife now. Please give her a chance." Mrs. Susan shook her head. "No, John. This woman has bewitched you. Open your eyes before it is too late." John was hurt by his mother's words, but he did not let them change how he felt about Mary. He knew his wife was a kind and loving woman. She always tried her best to please Mrs. Susan, but nothing she did was ever enough. Every morning, Mary would wake up early to cook breakfast, hoping to win Mrs. Susan's heart. "Good morning, Mama," she would say with a smile. Mrs. Susan would only frown and look away. She would not touch the food Mary prepared, choosing instead to cook for herself. She told the neighbors that Mary had put a spell on the food to make her sick. Mary was heartbroken. She had done nothing wrong, yet her mother-in-law treated her like an enemy. The rumors started to spread. Mrs. Susan began telling people in the village that Mary was a witch. She told them that Mary had used dark powers to make John marry her. Some villagers believed her, while others were not sure. One day, John had to travel to another town for work. Before leaving, he held Mary's hands and said, "Do not worry, my love. I will be back soon. Just be patient with my mother. Everything will be fine." Mary nodded, trying to be strong. She prayed in her heart that things would get better. But she had no idea that her troubles were just beginning. As soon as John left, Mrs. Susan's hatred grew worse. She refused to eat any food Mary prepared. She started throwing Mary's clothes outside. "You are a witch," she shouted one evening. "I do not want you in my house." Mary stood there, tears in her eyes. "Mama, I am not a witch," she said softly. "Why do you hate me so much?" But Mrs. Susan did not listen. She went into the house and locked the door, leaving Mary outside in the cold night. Mary had nowhere to go. She sat on the ground, hugging herself as the wind blew. She could not understand why her mother-in-law hated her this much. The night was long and painful, but Mary endured it. She prayed that John would return soon and take her away from this suffering. But what Mary did not know was that Mrs. Susan had a wicked plan. She was going to do something that would put Mary in even greater danger. The next morning, Mary woke up feeling weak and tired. She had barely slept because of the cold. Her back ached from sleeping on the hard ground, but she forced herself to stand up. She knocked on the door, hoping Mrs. Susan would let her in, but there was no answer. She sighed and walked to the backyard to fetch water. She wanted to clean the house and prepare food, hoping Mrs. Susan's heart would soften. But as she was about to enter the house, she heard whispers outside. Some women from the village had gathered near the house, talking in low voices. Mary could hear her name. "I told you," one of them said. "Mrs. Susan said she is a witch. That is why John is blind with love." "Yes," another woman added. "She must have used a love charm on him. John was such a good boy before he met her." Mary's heart sank. She had done nothing wrong, yet people believed she was a witch. She wiped the tears from her eyes and walked inside. She did not want them to see her cry. Later that day, Mrs. Susan did something terrible. She waited until Mary went to the market, then she sneaked into the backyard with a small black pot. Inside the pot, she placed the blood of a chicken she had killed, some feathers, and a small rag. She then poured the blood in front of Mary's door. She clapped her hands together and called out, "Neighbors, come and see." The villagers rushed to her compound. "What is it?" they asked. "Look." Mrs. Susan pointed at the blood on the ground. "This is proof. Mary is a witch. She is doing black magic in my house." The villagers gasped. Some shook their heads, while others looked at the blood with fear. "Where is Mary?" one man asked. "She is at the market," Mrs. Susan said. "But when she returns, she must explain this." A few hours later, Mary walked home, carrying a small basket of food. As she entered the compound, she noticed a crowd in front of the house. Her heart started beating fast. "What is happening?" she asked. Mrs. Susan stepped forward, pointing at the blood. "Look at what we found at your door," she shouted. "Witch. You have been caught." Mary dropped her basket. "I do not know anything about this," she said, her voice shaking. "Liar," one woman shouted. "You have been using witchcraft on John," another man said. "I swear, I did not do this," Mary cried. "I am not a witch." But no one believed her. The villagers became angry. Some started picking up stones. "We must drive her away," someone shouted. Mary took a step back, shaking her head in fear. "Please, believe me," she begged. "I have done nothing wrong." But the villagers were too angry to listen. One of them threw a stone, and it hit Mary's arm. She screamed in pain. "Yes, chase her away," Mrs. Susan said, smiling to herself. More people picked up stones, ready to throw them at Mary. She covered her face, expecting the worst. But suddenly, a loud voice stopped them. "Stop." Everyone turned to see John standing at the entrance of the compound. His face was filled with anger. "What is going on here?" he demanded. The crowd went silent. Some people dropped their stones. "Your wife is a witch," Mrs. Susan shouted. "Look at what she did." She pointed at the blood. John looked at the blood, then at Mary, who was crying. He clenched his fist and turned to his mother. "Mother," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "What have you done?" John's eyes burned with anger as he looked at his mother. He could not believe what was happening. His wife, the woman he loved, was standing in front of a crowd, bruised and crying. People were holding stones, ready to harm her. And the worst part, his own mother had started it all. "Mother," John said again, stepping forward. "What have you done?" Mrs. Susan folded her arms. "I am protecting you, my son. This woman is a witch. She has been using magic to control you." John shook his head. "That is a lie. Mary is not a witch." The villagers looked at each other, confused. Some lowered their stones. They had never seen John so angry before. John took a deep breath and turned to Mary. "Come here, my love," he said gently. Mary hesitated, still shaking, but she slowly walked to him. He held her close and wiped her tears. Then he turned back to the crowd. "My wife has done nothing wrong," he said firmly. "She has only shown kindness to my mother. She wakes up early to cook for her, cleans the house, and shows her respect. And how does my mother repay her? By lying against her." The villagers murmured. Some of them had seen how Mary tried to please Mrs. Susan. They started to wonder if they had been wrong. John then pointed at the blood on the ground. "Mother, how do you know this is Mary's doing?" he asked. "Were you here when she poured it?" Mrs. Susan opened her mouth to speak but stopped. She could feel the eyes of the villagers on her. She could see doubt on their faces. "Tell us the truth, Mrs. Susan," one old woman said. "Did you see Mary do this?" Mrs. Susan started sweating. She opened and closed her mouth, but no words came out. The pressure was too much. She knew she had been caught. Finally, she fell to her knees and burst into tears. "I did it," she cried. "I put the blood there. Mary is not a witch. I was just angry because John chose her over the woman I wanted." The crowd gasped. Some shook their heads in disappointment. Others looked at Mrs. Susan with disgust. "You lied to us," one man said. "You made us attack an innocent woman." Mrs. Susan nodded, still crying. "I am sorry," she wailed. "I was jealous. I did not want to lose my son." John looked at his mother, feeling both hurt and angry. "Mother, you have disgraced yourself today," he said. "You have almost killed my wife because of your wicked heart." He turned to the villagers. "You all believed the lie without proof. You hurt my wife without thinking twice. Look at her. She is bleeding. What if I had come late?" The villagers looked down in shame. They had been foolish. They had almost harmed an innocent woman because of gossip. John took Mary's hand. "We are leaving," he said. "John, please forgive me," Mrs. Susan cried. "Do not leave me alone." John looked at her with sadness. "You have pushed us away, Mother. You must live with the consequences of your actions." With that, he and Mary walked away, leaving Mrs. Susan on her knees, crying. The villagers slowly walked away too, shaking their heads. They had learned a lesson that day: never believe lies without proof. Mrs. Susan was left all alone. She had lost her son. She had lost her respect. And worst of all, she had lost the chance to have a good daughter-in-law who only wanted to love and care for her. She covered her face and wept. But it was too late. The damage had already been done.